The proper construct of a constitutional republic derides knowledge, borders, boundaries, restraints, obligations, limitations, professionalities, all of which derive a long-term ability, which exist without the advantages of the terrorists, or the hate groups, or the subversions, or the covert operations, which would actively act independently to that order, at which point the condemnation, rejection, and punishment of those who would seek an extrajudiciary activity or the function of an extra law or a unitary executive theory breaching the checks and balances in the Constitution as an act of rebellion is financially illiterate, as the prospects of the incompetent inferior operations trades on the short term, which is a demonstration of the incapability of the participant engaging in the exchanges, as the short-term traders historically have always discovered that their short-term sights derive their poverty. To the end that they derive their poverty, they materialize their complete and utter collapse in the destabilizing activities as the function as a disease of the collective community or in the government or corporation, etc. To that extent, the proof of the short term, such as the existence of a trust that would actively engage in a short term operations, trading on a weekly or a monthly operation, as opposed to the understood stability and norms of the yearly, would derive a criminal intention as an insurgency for destabilizing and demoralization of the prospect benefactors, which in the United States is the general public, or in any government really, is the public that is being protected by it. And to that end, the acknowledgement of the short-term decisions made independently of the center materializes that decentralized collapse by the failure trade strategies. The intention in the demoralization to the collapse becoming the objective is the proof positive of insurgent terrorism, or the operation of creating some kind of Northwoods operation, such as the creation of 9/11 by the Confederacy, promoted by Lindsey Graham, seeking to protect Confederate operation from criminal punishments for attacks against American interests in order to incite and excite the horrors and imaginations of the general public in order to extort a consent, similar to the function in the Russian Federation after the USSR collapsed, uh, creating a failure by capitalism, introducing it from the extortions from George Soros, which had arranged for it to be extorted, collapse similar to his professional specialty, similar to Jeffrey Sachs, who joined him in that operation. And the inevitability of the system's collapse derived as an inevitability becomes unavoidable, making them desperate to create a straw man argument or a defamation or a thing to scare the public or shock them away into compliance with non-activity inside the governing politic. That becomes true, systemically engages in the subversions of the psyops in order to get permission for the history against them, which they had historically derided against, and having been traumatized into compliance, subjugate themselves from those subversions, which would actively be reimbursed into the general construct for society, reproducing this in the Druids over which, having infiltrated from the uh, various parts of the world, has traumatized the West as I think it was the Bolshevik uprisings, engaging in the function of the non-violent tensions for communism against nations of the West in order to advance by sorceries and extortions and thefts, brutalizing the advantages by their insurgents, compromising their governments. To this extent, you have these hyper radicalizations which have shown their strange death of Europe as a prelude to the destruction of the United States, which then materializes the international revolution, which, having been generated, are derived by the white supremacist Confederates, which have always been communist, as is derived by their plantations or communes, which then exchanges as a pseudo-national capitalist operation, as their commune is its own castle or its own kingdom. And to this extent, those exchanges materialize in the traumas, which then hyperextenuate the functions of the extortions, which then normalize the criminal activities in the expansions from those conflicts, such as the United States and the War on Terror, derived by the United States was contracted to specialize in terrorist insurgents, actively became insufferably pathetic in that specialty as a false strength within an deriving this position of over-aggressive malice in order to standardize abuses against civilian populations and war against populations. To this extent, the intention is to turn it inwards against the American or Western peoples, which then also supports these similar abuses, which has been practicing these attacks, such as the genocide in Gaza, which, by definition, a reaction to the presumption of David Bohl's position from his steward's constitutional kingdom, which would then have had the treaty with the Israelis, which would have protected the Palestinians, which they were seeking to abuse arbitrarily without the protections, which creates the illusion of their criminality, which would then generate the justification of those abuses arbitrarily of their intimate, detailed specialists of theater illusion, which then materializes the sale of the retaliations and justification of the malice. And to this end, you have the consistent abuses, which would be, as it, a generic proof of what they would do against the Western nations, including the United States of America and its civilian population, which is a stated objective by these terrorist operators, which view their position in their algorithms to be able to create a mechanized workforce in order to engage in mass depopulation of the world population and their satanic operations of their anti-human agenda in their materialized occult, which being tiered similar to the function of the 33-degree Masons, have various entry points where the bottom will believe the exact opposite of the top, which generically believes that it is God, and thus the assumption upon the scientific study of the entry into a black hole acquires the position of the singularity of the universality of the individual, which is the universe, which then materializes the positive of the godhood of the elite over the pyramid scheme. And to this extent, you have those consistent material abuses and extortions, cons and subversions, according to historical, etc., which is their actual special. They're messing with the enemy, whereas the enemy is civilian populations, which, not having access to the majority of the information or technology, would easily be misdirected according to the extortions and abuses of secrets, historic and new, which would then materialize exponential increase in the amount of illusions generated, which redirect everyone into a mobbish outrage, as the function of an individual is highly intelligent and suave, but the intelligence of a group is benign and incompetent, as the function goes to the common denominator of the lowest intelligence of the mob. Thus, aggressive is the leader chaos or of the mob, which then derives the direction by the who engage by their wizards engage in the control and direction of the mob for these operations, creating lynch mobs such as the extension of KKK Klan rallies, which engage in pseudo law court structures with predetermined outcomes. They have a person in search of a crime and are too outraged and flustered in order to consider any kind of legitimate process outside of the function of the need to engage in an abuse as an emotional cathartic release. These counterproductive operations in that pursuit materialize the function of their financial incompetence as these perpetual destabilizations of the hyper-decentralization of the hyper-centralized executive power materialize the restoration of the KKK in the neo-KKK, which contracting in the government with various tricks such as the function of the NSA, subcontractors for private companies, which engage in the contracting with the general government, engage in individual violations of civilian law in violation of the federal law, which the federal law is prohibited from doing and the civilian law is prohibited from doing, and not allowed to do it and not allowed to do it magically turns into allowed to do it, which, of course, as we all know, is fraud. And thus, the engagement of the scam designed for a subhuman intelligence requires the broken minds of the general public to not see the most obvious glaring reality of the delusional and empathic, which engage in these illusions and redirections of the general public in order to capture everyone in Revelation's word with a strong delusion. Decentralization of these operations as they systematically dismantle the structure of ordered obligations and responsibilities and standards and norms and customs of office and its responsibilities and limitations materialize the innumerous rights being violated in the pursuit of this overextended function, such as Confederacy presumption of their war effort and war as a form of politics is another form of politics, and thus the identity of war as a form of politics materializes the normalization of their relations not provable to be guilty without the illusion, which then creates the position of reasonable doubt in the jury, which is systematically including the hyperextenuation of the subversion by the war efforts to create the illusions, which very strong illusions in order to misdirect for their lawfare, similar to the pursuit of Donald Trump, which is as it in of itself a misdirection. Donald Trump's presumably a part of that operation, proving the benign variant of the thing that they are pursuing as desired thing to repurpose and redirect, as all parties are engaged in the feudalist contest to overthrow the system and take the one ring to rule them all, and to this extent have the surveillance terrorist operations of the hyper-concentrated surveillance power and its weapons against civilian populations and its nonviolent weapons operations becoming the expansion of this function activity of military grade operations against the civilian population materialized infiltration by terrorist insurgents for the White Supremacist Communist Revolution, and the function of arbitrarily being able to point to people, saying people, individuals are become enemy combatants by the twisting of the finger or the tapping of the wand materializes the function of the instant classification of enemy combatant, realizing the full derived position of the delusion becomes manufactured evidence in and of itself, or guilt by accusation, realizing the full extension of the overextended position of the abuses without the laws of wars to be applied, which they then materially engage in those various subversions in order to engage in their operations of clan activities or the reascension of the Confederates' secret empire, which, having completely denied its reality to the general public, materialize its power by the misdirection of the civilians' lack of understanding how to protect themselves because they do not understand how the threat is manufactured. To this extent, full vulnerability creates a strait of desperation, which creates misdirection, which then creates systemic collapse of the general confidence, which then generates the obligation for force of retaliation, which then engages in redirection, which then, having formed a mob with power to redirect, engages in the systematic purges of the hyperextenuation, then materializes the collapse of all competitors until they've destroyed every system in and of itself, which includes their having sold the right of conquest to other nations against the United States and of the West, which then materializes their aiding and abetting of these operations as an act of treason, and after the security has been completely destroyed, it does not matter that they're in violation of anything because you cannot do anything. To the extent that you cannot convict a Confederate of anything, the fact that the community is completely destroyed and betrayed is derived by their own material insufferable stupidity, which is their own fault, as they, in their state of delusion of grandeur, pursue greedily the misdirected powers, fall into the trap of their incompetence, which was always insufferably inadequate. To this extent, you materially understand the threat against the existence of society is the existence of these whites, even of their captured categories of other races, such as the black community, Asian community, or others, which includes the specific PSYOP operations, such as which is derived by the, especially the Chinese communists projected in the estimate, which historically understood advantages in their communist revolution of purging the undesirables, and thus the position isn't the fact that it's Asian hate, but that they're Asian Americans hate, as Asian Americans are not Asian, quote unquote. The purge by those communists become a fundamental aspect of their identity, which is then reinforced and supported in the right of conquest by the white supremacists in their communist revolution, who say everyone who is not the right type of white gets purged, which includes the mutual overlapping interests of the other categories who would seek purges for their communist overlapping interests, having traded so in the long term, are patient of order and justice, claiming the irrational position that justice is merely the derived conclusion of any court, including the position of the permanence of the court, ignoring the obligations of the office for appeals and redirection and constant re-examination for perfection, which would be fair observation, which would be legal definition of justice, which then materially is ignored in subversion, as the communists share our words but not our definitions. As the function of rallies or courts without the function of the American judicial obligations, prerequisite procedures would be disqualifiers, including the use of cops who are disqualifying it, such as the breaking of the chain of custody, or planting fruit of the poison tree, or any of the other delusions, materializes the functional standard they have broken court, and court, having been broken, re-examined and reprocessed in other operations under more stability, which then materializes the disqualifications which are often ignored in favor of the lawfare in the KKK's war. And these disqualifications include special, nonsensical, fraudulent positions, which include the action of implying the secret weapons, which were fundamental to the creation of fruits of the poison tree in order to misdirect system, materializes the function of it being censored or other essential pieces of information being censored, including the activities of higher federal operations, which would use those secrets to censor the most important agents or the accused, preventing engaging in self-defense in violation of the Second Amendment, as the right to self-defense becomes fundamental in this operation. There's systematic dismantlement, such as we own the streets, position of dismantling the law and right that you are to be judged by a jury of your peers, materializes the position of that jury systematically being dismantled in that definition as to materially same thing, at which point disqualifying the function not as an American legal court, but as nothing more than bluster and blister and bowl. And to the extent that material bowl is nothing more than a Klan rally, it has no legal authority and must be disqualified on appeal by the examination of these operations war against the population as an attempt to leverage their war against the civilian government formed by the Constitution, which has concentrated collective sovereignty into the function of the purpose of all of our resources being purposed towards our agreed social obligations for mutual stability. Now, denoting the operations of the insurgents would indicate by various spells would actively be subverted by the changing of meanings and general understanding, including the use of their insurgencies for the individual empire, would leverage such operations, such as the use of Confederates on patrol or cops, which would then engage in non-service of law or non duty curve, and other subversions, as the function of the promotion of false advertisement materializes understood obligations and responsibilities which they would be derelict in their duty towards, on purpose as a point of privilege towards their extortion as an enemy combatant to the civilian population for the progression in their war against the American government. And as we all know, law enforcement requires service of law, and the function of the violation of those codes and procedures and obligations justify the function of clearing the hedge of law enforcement. You would have to engage in those operations, and these below law enforcement services of law conducts materializes the function of the enforcement of the cop or the use of the overextended position, such as standardized in many cases of sheriff's departments, which do not engage in law enforcement but engage in the function of controlling the region as the function of their extortion and the various subversions give themselves a degree of godly oversight powers as the function as though they themselves were the king or the government themselves, which would actively hyper concentrated in the example where they believe that Donald Trump is a white supremacist threat to the public. If that was true, he would try and create some kind of federal sheriff's would actively engage the hyperextenuation of those abuses, which would include Lindsey Graham's kidnapping operations in order to engage in the various extortions, to use national security operations against terrorist insurgents arbitrarily labeled enemy combatants on that basis, having certified their specific position in their systematic growth communism against the civilian population, such as their use of the secrets in order to destabilize or obstruct contracts for defamations or other hate crimes, economic violence, social violence, political violence, and so forth, being hate crimes being the fundamental aspect of their direct obligation, engages in the recrafting and reforming of society according to the central plan of the white supremacists. Now, if that's not true, then credit where credit is due, you passed, and it is whatever it is, in whichever direction you would derive it. But if that were the case, then the function of that human trafficking would derive a position of home health care, which would actively have caretakers, which would then engage in the various abuses and subversions and thefts, which would normalize and automate the function of the enforcement of the white supremacist communists, such as historic abuses against the Indians, includes the re-education of their parties in order to function of their being acceptable to the white supremacists, including the natural inferiority of them, which includes the various abuses which would be extorted in favor of the white supremacists, so that the white supremacists would receive the higher returns from the gains from those various extortions, which would be compelled by the communism for them to participate, traumatizing them economically into compliance as they've been demoralized and broken, therefore made more malleable slaves without the Satanist insurgents from the various operations at the top of their occult activity are the lead blackhead druids, which then materializes their function of their hyper connection, extension, and funding acceleration of Israel, which actively uses various groups such as Mossad, which I believe is very keen in its core ideology towards its specialty in deceit, and thus the function of its overlapping operations in the deceit illusion operation materializes the redirection of the information in order to materialize a false product, which, being a function such as the CIA operations, does not engage in law enforcement investigation. They engage in intelligence reports, and thus the capability of that function does not derive the objective of what the enemy combatant would do in material reality, but the material proof of the illusion, which only reinforces the direction of the deceiver creating the illusion in the first place and does not conduct any material national security purpose. Engagement of the general competence on standard of the common civilian becomes problematic as the capability to engage in of common intelligence, and therefore there are two general ways you can magically come up with a more sophisticated version, or you can do a kind of degrowth position similar to a childhood cartoon with where it was a video game and programs and stuff, where there was a kid who wanted to become more important, and his companions were actively more valuable than he is inside of the games, and he asked uh, a wise leader and most competent of everyone. And there were two ways the wise leader said that he can do this. Number one, he can study. And in energy and focus and concentration this is going to take, and it's going to be very burdensome. And the wise old man, second one, is you can make everyone else stupider. Thus, the creation of that created no material advantage except for everyone else is insufferably pathetic. And to this extent, being real world dangerous materializes the disadvantage of their compelled incompetence, which then systemically threatens the complete destruction and death of the primary population of the community, as if the game was lost, then they would systematically be erased or killed. Is true and is being applied generically against the general population, such as with the fake education system overseen by the white supremacist druids, such as the historic position of those derived as some kind of wizard schools, materializing the superiority of the Ivy League, the elites, quote unquote, materializing the function of their extortions and abuses against the general public in the redirection in their various cons, where they specialize in the subversion of mis and disinformation for the specific abuse and control over the majority population. And these psychopaths engage in various lies, which uses the various subversions, including retaliation, against those who challenge their delusion or illusion or recrafting or reforming reality, quote unquote, in favor of whatever they wanted, as their war against reality and challenging compels their cult loyalties towards this function as they hyper accelerate towards their arbitrary ambitions and their cited goals. Is specifically understood as true according to Dog Whistle's position of general policies and subversion of various groups and categories, similar to the function of in the black community, close to white community, as an example. I believe this happened for real, but I'm not sure the details specifically. Where there's a white school that is hyper invested into, and all of the money is redirected into it and avoided from the poor community, which is marked as black, derived by their historic goals, such as from redlining, then materializes that action of depravity and having hyper concentrated all of the wealth and upgrades of the building, any possibility of the political landscape changing, redirecting towards the poor community, as the rich community, having already received the upgrades, do not need the additional funding anymore, are proof positive of the extortion and abuse, as anyone that would come in to make those changes would be retaliated against by their secret terrorist operations, materializing the political violence for the economic violence in order to constantly reinforce the position of the racist dog whistle that the position was not racist but economic and a matter of status, and status being derived by their centrally planned communism is derived by race, proving the war on the civilian population scam.